The crystal chandelier above the dining table hummed, a low, electric sound that felt like it was vibrating inside my teeth. I kept my head down. My focus narrowed to the silver fork in my hand and the small, stubborn piece of asparagus on my plate. Around me, the room was filled with the sharp, bright laughter of people who didn't see me, even though I had spent the last 6 hours preparing the very floor they stood on. "Oh, don't mind her," my daughter-in-law, Chloe, chirped. Her voice had that artificial sweetness, like saccharin that leaves a bitter aftertaste. She leaned back in her chair, a glass of expensive Bordeaux, my husband's favorite vintage, clutched in her manicured hand. She gestured toward me with a casual flick of her wrist, as if she were pointing out a piece of old furniture that didn't quite fit the room anymore. "She's just the elderly babysitter we don't pay," she laughed. The table erupted in a chorus of polite, stifled giggles from her New York friends. I felt the heat crawl up my neck, but I didn't flush. I didn't cry. I simply pressed my thumb against the cool edge of the mahogany table, the table Charles and I had bought 40 years ago when we had nothing but a dream and a small apartment. I glanced at my son, Ethan. He was busy laughing at a joke one of Chloe's colleagues had made, his eyes never once drifting to the head of the table where I sat, shrinking into the shadows. He heard her. I knew he did. But his silence was a heavier weight than Chloe's words. "She's so good with the kids, really," Chloe continued, her voice rising to ensure everyone captured her generosity. "And she keeps the house so tidy. It's like having a ghost that cooks and cleans. It saves us a fortune on staff." I placed my fork down. The sound of metal hitting china was small, but to me, it sounded like a gunshot in a library. I looked at Chloe. She looked back, a triumphant, shallow glint in her eyes, confident in the belief that I was too old, too tired, or too broken to understand the sting of her tongue. She thought she was speaking a language of power that I couldn't translate. She was wrong. I didn't speak. I just reached for my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. I let the silence stretch, watching the way her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second when I didn't look away. They saw a babysitter. They saw a maid. They saw a woman whose time had passed. But as I looked around this room, my room, I realized they had forgotten one very important detail. And soon, I would remind them. The party eventually bled into the late hours, a blur of clinking glasses and voices that felt like sandpaper against my nerves. When the last guest left, the house didn't return to peace. It settled into a heavy, artificial silence. Chloe and Ethan vanished upstairs, their laughter muffled by the heavy oak doors, leaving me alone with the wreckage of their celebration. I stood in the kitchen, my back aching, looking at the mountain of crystal and fine china. This was the babysitter's domain now. I picked up a wine glass, one of the few Charles, and I hadn't chipped over 40 years of marriage. I didn't use the dishwasher. I preferred the scalding heat of the water on my hands, the way the steam rose to blur the sharp edges of the room. It was the only warmth I felt in this house. Ethan used to stand right here, on a wooden stool Charles had made, waiting for me to hand him a damp towel so he could help dry the spoons. Now, he didn't even notice the gray in my hair or the way my breath hitched when I carried the heavy serving platters. He had become a stranger who spoke my son's name, but wore a mask carved by someone else's hands. I dried the last glass and walked slowly to my room, or what they now called the guest suite. They had moved my antique dresser to make room for a Peloton bike that Chloe used twice a month. My history was being shoved into corners, 1 square foot at a time. I sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress too firm for my old bones. In the dark, the house hummed with a different frequency. I heard the floorboards creak upstairs, Chloe's sharp, rhythmic footsteps. She was moving things again, rearranging, erasing. I reached into my nightstand and pulled out Charles's old pocket watch. It had stopped the day he died, the hands frozen at 4 to 12. I held it against my palm, the cold metal slowly warming from my skin. "Just the babysitter," I whispered to the empty room. The words didn't make me cry anymore. They made me think. I thought about the deed to this house, tucked away in a safe they didn't have the combination to. I thought about the trust fund Ethan assumed was a bottomless well. They thought I was a ghost, haunting my own hallways, a woman who had forgotten how to speak. They were so busy looking past me that they never noticed I was the only one holding the keys to the very ground they walked on. Tonight, the babysitter was going to sleep, but tomorrow, the owner was going to wake up. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window, but it brought no warmth to the room. I was already at the stove, the smell of bacon and fresh coffee filling the air scents that used to mean family, but now felt like a chore I performed for strangers. Chloe walked in, her eyes glued to her phone, barely acknowledging the plate I set before her. She didn't say, "Thank you." She didn't even look up. She just pushed the eggs aside to make room for her laptop. "Ethan," she called out as my son entered the room, "did you talk to the bank about the joint access? We need that transfer finalized by Friday." Ethan didn't look at me either. He grabbed a piece of toast and mumbled something about technicalities and legal paperwork. I stood by the sink, my back to them, my hands trembling slightly as I scrubbed a pot that didn't need scrubbing. I wasn't invisible, but I was being treated like a wall, something they spoke around, not to. That's when I saw it. On the corner of the marble island sat a bank envelope. It wasn't sealed. It had been opened with a sharp, clean cut, and my name was printed clearly on the front. It was my quarterly statement for the trust Charles had left exclusively for me. I picked it up. The paper felt heavy, like lead in my fingers. "Oh, Ethan thought that was just a bill," Chloe said casually, finally looking at me with a gaze as cold as a winter morning. "We're just trying to consolidate the household expenses. It's easier if everything is under one roof, don't you think?" I didn't answer. I looked at the statement and saw a withdrawal I hadn't authorized, a significant sum labeled as a consultation fee. "You opened my mail," I said, my voice low, steady, and devoid of the anger they expected. "We're a family," Chloe replied, her smile not reaching her eyes. "There shouldn't be secrets, especially when you're getting to an age where things can get confusing." I folded the paper and tucked it into my apron pocket. Later that day, I walked through the house with new eyes. I noticed the small things I had chosen to ignore before. My favorite landscape painting moved to the basement, replaced by an abstract piece I hated. The way the hallway closet no longer held my winter coats, but Chloe's designer handbags. I wasn't just a babysitter to them. I was an asset they were slowly liquidating while I was still breathing in the next room. I sat in Charles's old study, the one room they hadn't dared to touch yet, and picked up the phone. My silence wasn't a white flag. It was a cloak. "Hello, David," I said when the lawyer answered. "It's about the deed, and I need to change my power of attorney, immediately." They thought I was the one losing my grip on reality. But as I stared at the wedding photo of Charles and me on the desk, I realized I had never seen things more clearly. That afternoon, I sat in the garden, the late autumn breeze tugging gently at the sleeves of my sweater. The roses had already withered, leaving behind brittle stems and tired soil. I hadn't pruned them this season, a task Charles always did with such care. I missed the sound of his clippers and the way he used to bring me the first bloom of every spring, wrapped in a paper towel with dirt still clinging to the roots. He would have noticed the way I hesitated before entering my own kitchen, or how my name had started disappearing from the mail. He used to tell me, "You don't need to speak to be strong. Just be still and let them show you who they are." And that's exactly what I was doing, letting them show me their true colors. I walked back inside and sat at the kitchen table, the same one where we used to play Scrabble every Friday night. My hand reached for the drawer without thinking, the one where we kept pens, notepads, and keys, but it was empty, cleaned out by hands that didn't value our history. The second drawer was also empty, and the third had been filled with fancy cutlery wrapped in velvet that didn't belong to us. A soft heat simmered beneath my skin, not quite anger yet, but a growing awareness. Later, I retreated to the attic, the only place Chloe's minimalist eyes hadn't reached. I pulled out Charles's old lockbox. Inside, tucked beneath our mortgage documents, was a handwritten letter from him. "If they ever make you feel small," it read, "remember who paid for this roof, who built this life with you, and who trusted you to protect it. You know more than you think." I sat still for a long time, the paper crinkling in my hands. My silence wasn't a sign of defeat. It was a strategic withdrawal. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like a babysitter or a guest. I felt like a woman with a plan. I began making a list on a yellow legal pad. The bank account numbers Chloe thought I'd forgotten, the dates of the unauthorized withdrawals, and the names of the people who had actually built this estate. Every time they spoke over me or treated me like a ghost, I simply added a line to my notes. They thought they were playing a game of chess against an empty chair. They had no idea the chair was occupied by the person who owned the board. The next morning, the doorbell rang. It was Lily, my neighbor's granddaughter, a sharp, observant girl in her late 20s who'd always treated me with unexpected warmth. She brought over a basket of scones and jam, saying her grandmother had extra and insisted I share it with the classiest lady on the block. She always had a way with words. We sat on the porch for a while, drinking tea and watching the wind pull golden leaves off the maple trees. She asked how Ethan was doing, and I gave a non-committal answer. She hesitated, then looked me straight in the eye. "Can I ask you something? And I hope I'm wrong?" I raised an eyebrow. "I saw your daughter-in-law at the post office last week," Lily whispered. "She was with some guy in a suit. He kept asking her about signatures and power of attorney stuff." She seemed annoyed he brought it up in public. My stomach didn't drop this time. It just tightened. "And yesterday," Lily added, "I overheard her on the phone in the driveway. Something about transferring ownership. She hung up when she saw me. She bit her lip. I don't want to overstep. Maybe it's nothing. But I figured if my grandma were in your shoes, I'd want someone to say something." I reached across the table and gently touched her hand. "Thank you for not staying silent. It wasn't just the mail or the missing furniture anymore. It wasn't even the mocking French or being called an unpaid babysitter. It was the fact that they thought I wouldn't notice, that they thought I was a puzzle they had already solved." Lily stayed for another hour, talking about old music and her plans to move to Chicago. She made me laugh, a sound that felt foreign in my own home. When she left, I didn't feel alone. I felt seen. But I also felt a quiet urgency, the kind Charles used to describe as the moment before a storm, when the air goes still. I walked upstairs to my room and opened the drawer where I kept my documents. Birth certificate, trust paperwork, the deed, everything was still in my name. For now, I knew then that whatever game Chloe thought she was playing, it wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. They thought they were erasing me, but they were actually giving me a reason to be remembered. That evening, the house was unusually quiet. Chloe was out for a networking dinner, though I didn't bother asking where or with whom. Ethan stayed upstairs, the rhythmic tapping on his laptop echoing down the hallway, a sound of productivity that now felt like a hollow illusion. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, looking at the closed doors. Theirs, mine. The room that used to be a welcoming space for guests, but had been cold-bloodedly reclaimed by Chloe's minimalist ambition. I walked into the kitchen and made a pot of chamomile tea, Charles's favorite. The kettle hissed like a whisper that knew too much, a sharp contrast to the suffocating silence of the house. I sat at the mahogany table, staring at the steam rising from my mug. My thoughts weren't as still as the room. A line had been crossed. It wasn't just when she mocked me in French, or when she opened my mail, or even when she moved my history into the attic. The true violation was their assumption that my silence was consent. They mistook my patience for blindness. I was neither blind nor broken. My name was still on the deed, and the trust fund Charles built remained intact. They were circling like vultures dressed in cashmere, but they hadn't realized the prey was the one holding the keys to the cage. I did something simple. I picked up a yellow legal pad and wrote 2 names, my lawyer and Charles's accountant, just in case. Then, I made another list, quiet things only I would know, the combination to the floor safe hidden under the rug in the study, the location of the backup documents, and the names of the friends Charles told me to trust if things ever went south. It wasn't a plan for revenge, not yet. It was awareness. And in this house, awareness was the ultimate power. When Ethan finally came downstairs, he looked at me with a half smile. "You've been kind of quiet lately," he said, not realizing how much weight that silence carried. "I've been listening," I replied simply. He paused, then shrugged. "That's good. It's probably nice not to have to deal with so much stress." He finished his glass of water and excused himself, leaving me alone once more. But it didn't feel the same this time. I wasn't waiting for them to change anymore. I was waiting for the right moment to remind them who actually owned the roof over their heads. I was ready. The shift came quietly, like a change in the wind before a storm. 2 days later, Solène, as she insisted I call her when guests were around, made crepes for breakfast. "Something light," she said, placing the plate in front of me with a tilt of her head, as if she were feeding a child or a pet. She even added a sprig of mint for garnish, a superficial touch to mask weeks of veiled insults. "I thought you'd appreciate something more. European," she said, her smile tight and rehearsed. I looked at the plate, then at her. Merci, I said politely, and nothing more. I saw her eyes flick toward me, a momentary pause in her scripted grace. She was looking for a crack, a sign of the confused old woman she wanted me to be, but I didn't give her the satisfaction. Later that afternoon, I heard her on a Zoom call in the den. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but the door was cracked open, and her voice, sharp, cold, and fluent in French, carried easily through the hallway. Elle pense que je suis gentille. Elle n'a aucune idée que c'est presque à nous, she whispered into her headset. She thinks I'm being kind. She has no idea it's almost ours. I didn't flinch. I simply stepped away and took the long way around the house, letting her believe I was still wandering in the dark. That evening, while she was out again, I sat at my laptop and sent a quiet, formal email to Charles's accountant. No accusations, just a request. Can we review the trust allocations together sometime next week? The reply came within the hour, warm and respectful. You were always the one who kept the books balanced, he wrote. Charles trusted your judgment completely. It was the validation I needed to stop being the ghost in my own hallways. I spent the rest of the night gathering papers quietly, methodically. I checked dates, signatures, and access logs. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was documenting reality. The next morning, at lunch, Solène slipped again. Thinking I was out of earshot, she muttered another sharp line in French to her phone. She's useless. Ethan is too soft to act. I'll handle it. I placed my napkin down, looked her directly in the eye, and spoke in a tone as calm as a still lake. Tu crois que je ne comprends pas? I said gently. Je comprendrai bien, depuis le début. You think I don't understand? I've understood all along. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I'd heard in years. Her face didn't just pale, it froze. I didn't wait for her to recover. I simply cleared my plate and walked away, leaving the babysitter behind forever. The next afternoon, Ethan asked if we could talk. We sat on the porch, the one Charles had built the summer before he passed. The old wood creaked under Ethan's weight, a sound that used to feel like home but now felt like a warning. He didn't look at me right away. His eyes were fixed on the withered garden. She's been stressed, he began, his voice thin and defensive. Planning the wedding, moving. She thinks maybe we all need some space. I sipped my tea, letting the silence force him to continue. I didn't help him bridge the gap. She suggested we consider a different arrangement, he added, finally meeting my gaze. I knew what that meant. A calmer, quieter place with people, my own age. Is that your decision, Ethan, or hers? I asked calmly. He hesitated, the guilt flickering in his eyes like a dying candle. We just think it might be best, he whispered. We. Always we. He didn't even realize he was reciting a script written in French and translated into betrayal. I stood up slowly and walked inside to the study. I opened the drawer and took out a manila folder containing the trust documents and the deed to the house, the one still firmly in my name. I returned to the porch and placed it gently on the table between us. I've made an appointment with the lawyer for next week, I said. Just to clarify a few things regarding the unauthorized withdrawals and the power of attorney paperwork, your fiancé has been researching. Ethan's face went pale. He looked down at the folder as if it were a coiled snake. You're not angry? He stammered. No, Ethan, I said, looking at the boy I thought I knew. I'm aware, and sometimes awareness is sharper than rage. Later that night, I heard them behind their bedroom door. Whispers, urgent, frantic, the sound of paper shuffling. They were realizing the babysitter had been counting the silver all along. I didn't need to shout. I just needed to show them that while they were busy playing with my kindness, I was busy protecting our legacy. The house felt larger that night, as if it were exhaling a long-held breath. I wasn't waiting for an apology anymore. I was preparing the final lesson. I didn't plan a confrontation. I planned a dinner, something simple yet substantial. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans sautéed with garlic. These were the recipes Solène always called too heavy for her refined palate. But I cooked them anyway. I set the table exactly the way Charles liked it, with cloth napkins, real silverware, and candles that didn't smell like a department store. He always said food deserved to be the only thing that spoke. Ethan came down first, his face a map of confusion and guilt. "What's the occasion?" he asked, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Just dinner," I said, my voice as smooth as the silk scarf around my neck. Solène followed, dressed as if she were attending a gallery opening rather than a family meal. She wore a tight, practiced smile, like someone who knew a test was coming but couldn't find the study guide. For 10 minutes, the only sound was the clinking of forks against china. I watched them. Ethan stared at his plate. Solène picked at her food, her eyes darting around the room she had already tried to redecorate in her mind. Then, I placed the final dish in the center of the table, a warm apple tart, its scent of cinnamon and butter filling the air. "You made dessert?" Solène asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "I did," I replied. She hesitated, her fingers drumming against the mahogany. "You've been quiet lately." "I've been busy," I said. "With what?" "Preparing." Solène put down her fork, the clatter echoing in the silent room. "For what, exactly?" I folded my hands neatly on my lap and looked her directly in the eyes. "For the moment when you realize this house isn't yours, the money isn't yours, and I'm not the fool you thought I was." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush the spirit. Ethan froze, staring at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking a language he'd never heard. Solène's artificial smile dropped, revealing the cold, calculating woman beneath. "The documents you've been trying to access are protected," I continued, my tone conversational, as if I were discussing the weather. "Legally, financially, personally." "I don't know what you're implying," she hissed, her face hardening. "I'm not implying," I said, standing up and picking up my wine glass. "I'm informing. I've loved this family. I've given to it my time, my money, and my patience. But generosity is not the same as weakness." I looked at my son, then at the woman who thought she could erase me. I left the tart on the table untouched, just like their plans, and walked out of the room. I left them there, surrounded by a warmth they no longer deserved. They didn't touch the tart. I watched from the hallway mirror, the one angled just enough to reflect the dining room. Ethan sat frozen, his head bowed as if the weight of the ceiling were resting on his shoulders. Solène slowly reached for her glass, but she didn't drink. Her hand trembled, just slightly a small hairline crack in her porcelain mask. They said nothing. The candles flickered, burning lower and lower, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like judges watching them from the corners of the room. It was the kind of silence that made the walls feel like they were leaning in to listen, recording every unsaid apology and every jagged breath. After a long while, Ethan stood and began clearing the table. He moved slowly, like a man walking through a thick fog, his movements mechanical and hollow. Solène followed him into the kitchen, but she didn't look at me when she passed. I didn't expect her to. Predators rarely look at the ones who survived them. The next morning, the house was too quiet, a sterile, unnatural silence. No music, no coffee brewing, no rhythmic tapping of laptops overhead. By noon, I realized they were gone. Not permanently, but they had fled the echo of my words, perhaps to find a new corner to whisper in. I spent the day in the garden. I pulled weeds, trimmed dead stems, and turned soil that hadn't been touched in months. It felt good grounding. I didn't need noise. I needed the clarity that only manual labor and fresh air could provide. That evening, Ethan came home alone. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, the shadows of the porch obscuring his face. "She's thinking of going back to New York for a while," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't look up from my book. "She needs space." She said, "Maybe we rushed into all of this." "Maybe you did," I said softly. He sat across from me, looking smaller than I remembered. "You're really not mad?" "No." "Then what are you?" I looked at him, my son, the little boy who once believed I could fix anything with a bandage and a kiss. "Tired," I said. He flinched. Not because I was loud, but because the truth was a weight he finally had to carry. Tired of being stepped around, tired of pretending not to hear, and tired of being generous with people who mistook my grace for invisibility. He said nothing else. And for the first time in this house, that silence felt like peace. Solène didn't leave right away. For 2 more days, she lingered in the house like perfume that won't wash out, polite, careful, and suddenly, overly helpful in the kitchen. She was constantly offering to run an errand or take care of something, her voice now a pitch higher than usual. But her eyes told the truth. She was measuring exits, calculating risks, and watching me as if I were a locked safe she had failed to crack. On the third morning, I found her in the study. The drawer where I kept Charles's papers had been pulled open. Half its contents shifted. She froze when she saw me standing in the doorway, my shadow stretching across the floor. "I was looking for stamps," she said, her fingers clutching a blank envelope as if it were a shield. I nodded slowly, my gaze never leaving hers. "There's a drawer in the kitchen for that," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. She offered a thin, brittle smile and brushed past me without another word. That night, she didn't join us for dinner. She claimed she wasn't feeling well, a convenient excuse to avoid the silence that now defined our meals. The next morning, she was gone. No goodbye, no dramatic exit. There was only a small, cold note on the marble counter that read, "Need time to think. Please take care of Ethan." She didn't even bother to sign her name. Ethan found the note after his morning run. He stared at that piece of paper for a long time, his shoulders slumped before placing it face down next to the fruit bowl. He went upstairs without a word, and I didn't follow him. Some lessons, I've learned, are not meant to be interrupted. For the next week, the house finally exhaled. There was space again, not just in the hallways, but in the very air we breathed. I cleaned out the drawer she had rifled through, reorganized my history, and placed a small, sturdy lock on it. Not because I was afraid, but because I was done pretending to trust those who hadn't earned it. Solène had played a game she thought was a guaranteed win, using her charm, her polish, and her private whispers in French as weapons. She looked at me and saw an old woman with too many memories and not enough fight left. She was wrong. And she learned the hardest way possible. You don't disrespect a woman who has lived through more than you can imagine and expect her to remain invisible. You don't gamble with her life and act surprised when the house quite literally does not fall into your hands. I was reclaiming my seat. A week passed. The house no longer felt like a battlefield or a museum of things I wasn't allowed to touch. No more French whispers hissed behind my back, no more rearranged drawers, and no more passive remarks disguised as compliments. Just the sound of morning birds, the scent of strong coffee, and my own breathing steady and grounded. Ethan stayed, but his footsteps were softer now, less entitled. He started helping with the garden again, not because I asked, but because he remembered the rhythm of it. One afternoon, we sat on the porch, the same spot where Charles used to read. The sun filtered through the trees, soft and golden, almost as if it were offering forgiveness. "She was never going to stay, was she?" Ethan spoke first, his voice heavy with realization. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence settle between us like a comfortable blanket. "I think," I said finally, "she came here expecting to inherit a story she hadn't earned." He nodded slowly, the lines of worry on his face softening. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the boy he used to be beneath the regret and the mistakes. "You saw it," I said gently. "You just didn't want to admit what it meant." We sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that doesn't sting, but heals. The next day, I took back my seat at the head of the table. It wasn't a grand statement, it was simply a return to where I belonged. I made Charles's favorite roast and used the old gravy boat he loved. I wore the apron Ethan had made for me in the 3rd grade, the one with smudged letters that spelled out "Best Mom Ever." When we ate, it wasn't quiet out of discomfort anymore. It was quiet like gratitude, like memory, like home. That night, I went into the study and opened the top drawer. I pulled out a photo of Charles and me on our honeymoon in nice sunlight bouncing off the sea, his hand wrapped tightly around mine. I smiled, not because everything was fixed, but because I was no longer shrinking to make space for people who couldn't hold it with grace. I hadn't lost my voice. I had just waited for the right moment to use it. And when I did, it was enough.